You know this story. The Last Supper, the Garden of Gethsemane, the kiss, 30 pieces of silver, the arrest, the trial, the cross. Judas Iscariot, the betrayer, the name that has meant treachery in every language that has ever borrowed it for 2000 years. In Italian, in French, in Arabic, in Hindi, to call someone a Judas is to call them the worst thing a person can be. You know it like this. Judas was one of the 12 apostles, one of Jesus' closest companions, trusted enough to carry the group's money. He went to the chief priests and agreed to hand Jesus over to them for 30 pieces of silver. He identified Jesus to the soldiers in the garden with a kiss. Jesus was arrested, tried, and crucified. Judas, overcome with remorse, returned the silver and hanged himself. Betrayal, greed, guilt, death. The perfect villain's arc. Now let me tell you about a manuscript discovered in a cave in Egypt, a text that was suppressed for 1700 years, that the early church called dangerous and order destroyed, that survived in a decaying leather pouch in a cave while empires rose and fell around it. And what it says about who Judas actually was. Not a betrayer. The only one who understood. The version of Judas that most people know comes from 4 sources: the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These were selected as canonical by the early church in the centuries after Jesus' death from among dozens of competing texts, many of which told very different stories. The selection process was not neutral, it was political. The church that was forming in the 1st century CE needed a coherent story, a story that supported specific theological positions, specific institutional structures, specific understandings of who Jesus was and what his death meant. Texts that complicated these positions were suppressed. Some were burned, some were buried, some were simply forgotten. But here is what is strange about the canonical Judas. If Jesus knew everything and the Gospels are explicit that he did, then he knew Judas would hand him over. He knew it at the Last Supper. He said so directly. And he let it happen. In John's Gospel, Jesus even tells Judas directly, "What you are going to do quickly." He did not stop it. He did not warn the others in time to prevent it. He did not flee. He told Judas to proceed. Which means the betrayal in the Gospel's own logic was not a surprise. It was not a failure of trust. It was the plan. And someone had to carry it out. In 1970, or possibly slightly earlier, the exact date is disputed, a leather-bound Coptic manuscript was found by farmers in a cave near the village of Carrara in Middle Egypt. The cave is in the region of ancient Lycopolis, in an area that had been a center of early Christian and Gnostic communities in the 1st centuries CE. The manuscript changed hands multiple times on the antiquities black market over the following decades. It spent years in a safe deposit box in Hicksville, New York. It deteriorated badly. By the time serious scholars gained access to it, large sections had crumbled and the pages were fragmentary. It took years of painstaking reconstruction, multispectral imaging, infrared photography, the patient work of scholars reassembling fragments like a puzzle where pieces were missing and might never be found. What they found, what the National Geographic Society published to global attention in 2006, was the Gospel of Judas. A text the early church had condemned as heretical in 180 CE that Irenaeus of Lyon had specifically warned Christians to avoid, that had been lost for 17 centuries. In it, Jesus speaks directly to Judas, separately from the other apostles, privately. He tells Judas that he is different from the others, that he understands things the others do not, that he will be the one who carries the most important task. He says, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." The man that clothes me, the physical body, the vessel. In the Gospel of Judas, handing Jesus over to the authorities was not a betrayal. It was the final act of discipleship. The Gospel of Judas is a Gnostic text. To understand why it says what it says, you need to understand what Gnosticism was. Gnosticism was not a single religion. It was a broad spiritual tradition present in the first centuries CE across the Mediterranean and Middle East that believed salvation came through gnosis, direct, personal, experiential knowledge of the divine, not through faith alone, not through institutional membership, through knowing. The Gnostic Christians, and there were many of them, in many varieties understood Jesus' message very differently from the tradition that would eventually become Orthodox Christianity. For the Gnostics, the physical body was not the important thing, the spirit was the important thing. The imprisonment of the divine spark in physical matter was the problem that Jesus came to solve. His death, his release from the physical was not a sacrifice for sin, it was a liberation, the proof that the spirit is free of the body. In this framework, the person who helped Jesus shed his physical form was not committing an act of evil. They were completing the mission. The scholar Elaine Pagels of Princeton University, who spent her career studying Gnostic texts including the Nag Hammadi library, documented how the suppression of Gnostic Christianity was not primarily about theology, it was about power. Gnostic Christianity had no bishops, no hierarchy, no institutional structure. Anyone could access the divine directly through knowledge. That was incompatible with an institution that needed authority to flow through specific people in specific roles. So the Gnostic texts were suppressed, and Judas, the figure who made the most sense in the Gnostic reading of the story, was made into history's greatest villain. Go back to the Last Supper, not the painting, the text. In the Gospel of John, the canonical text, the one that has been in Bibles for 2000 years, Jesus says something that has troubled careful readers for centuries. He identifies Judas as the betrayer. He dips bread and gives it to Judas. The text says, after he received the bread, Satan entered into him, and Jesus said to him, "What you are going to do quickly." The other disciples, the text tells us, did not understand what this exchange meant. Some thought Jesus was telling Judas to go buy something for the feast, or to give something to the poor. They didn't understand. Judas understood. And he went and did it. Think about what this means in the logic of the story. Jesus chose 12 apostles. He spent 3 years with them. He knew each of them completely, their strengths, their weaknesses, their capacity for understanding. When he needed someone to carry out the most important and most terrible task in his ministry, he chose Judas. Not Peter, who was impulsive and would have refused. Not John, who was beloved but young. Not Thomas, who doubted. Not any of the others. Judas. The one who was trusted with the money. The one who was practical. The one who could be relied upon to do what was required even when what was required was unbearable. The one who loved Jesus enough to destroy himself doing what Jesus asked. In the Gospel of Judas, Jesus tells him, "You will be cursed by the other generations and you will come to rule over them." 2000 years later, this prophecy has been exactly fulfilled. Judas is the most cursed name in the Western tradition. His face has been painted with hooked nose and yellow robe, the visual codes of anti-Semitic caricature for 15 centuries. His name means treachery in dozens of languages. Children are not named Judas. The name is a wound. And he has ruled over every telling of the story. Because without Judas, there is no arrest. Without the arrest, there is no trial. Without the trial, there is no crucifixion. Without the crucifixion, in the logic of Christian theology, there is no salvation. The entire architecture of 2 billion people's faith rests on what Judas did in the Garden of Gethsemane. He is the most essential character in the story. The historian William Klassen, in his scholarly work on Judas, examined every use of the Greek word that is translated as betrayed in the New Testament. His finding, the word used paradidomai more accurately means handed over, transmitted, delivered. It is the same word used to describe how the tradition was passed from Jesus to his disciples. Judas handed Jesus over using the same word that described how Jesus handed on his teaching. The betrayer and the teacher used the same gesture. 30 pieces of silver. the price of a slave under Mosaic law, the number so associated with Judas that it has become a metaphor for selling out, for accepting money to do something that should not be for sale. But look at what Judas does with the money in Matthew's Gospel, the only Gospel that mentions the price at all. He returns it. He goes back to the chief priests and tries to undo what he has done. He says, "I have sinned in betraying innocent blood." He throws the coins into the temple. He goes and hangs himself. This is not the behavior of someone who acted from greed. This is the behavior of someone who could not live with what they had done, who understood the full weight of it, who tried to give it back. The grief in that scene, the returned silver, the temple, the tree, is the grief of someone who loved what they destroyed. If Judas had simply sold Jesus for money, there would be no grief. You don't throw away money and hang yourself over a profitable transaction. You do those things when you have done something you were asked to do by someone you loved and it has cost you everything, when the task is complete and the person who asked is gone and you are left alone with what completing it means. Not a traitor's death. A soldier's death, someone who followed orders that destroyed them. The story of Judas has been told for 2000 years as the story of the perfect betrayal, the cautionary tale about greed, about proximity to greatness without understanding it, about the human capacity to sell out what is sacred. But the Gospel of Judas and the serious scholarship that has grown around it since its publication tells a different story. A story about the person asked to do what no one else could do, who was trusted with the most unbearable task precisely because he was trusted absolutely, who did it, and who could not survive having done it. There is a reason this version resonates so deeply right now. We live in a world that regularly asks people to do difficult, costly, necessary things and then writes them out of the story when the thing is done. The person who delivers the hard truth, the one who carries out the decision everyone agreed was necessary but no one wanted to execute, the one who is used by something larger than themselves, and left with the weight of it. The Gospel of Judas was buried in a cave in Egypt for 1700 years. The tradition that buried it became the dominant spiritual framework of the Western world. And Judas, the man who may have been asked, who may have understood, who definitely could not live with what he had done, became the word for the worst thing a person can be. In a garden, in the dark, a man identified his teacher, two soldiers, with a kiss. We have called it betrayal for 2000 years. The older text calls it something else. It calls it the completion of the mission, the final act of the only disciple who understood what the mission actually was. Script by Grey Wall Stories. Every wall holds a story. Some walls were built to keep the truth inside a cave.